If the early tariffs were a warning shot, the next phase was a full-scale escalation. By mid-2018, the Trump administration accused China of intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and massive trade imbalances. Officials argued that decades of diplomacy had failed, and tariffs were the only way to force change. The United States announced tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, targeting electronics, machinery, and consumer products. The message was clear. Washington was ready for economic confrontation. Trump's supporters viewed the move as long overdue, saying previous leaders had allowed China to grow stronger at America's expense. China didn't stay silent. Within weeks, Beijing responded with its own tariffs on American exports, particularly agricultural goods like soybeans, pork, and corn. Farmers across the Midwest suddenly found themselves caught in the middle of a geopolitical conflict. The trade war wasn't just a policy debate anymore. It was affecting real communities and industries. Financial markets became volatile. Companies started moving factories to other countries to avoid tariffs. Supply chains that had taken decades to build began shifting almost overnight. For multinational corporations, uncertainty became the new normal. Trump argued that the pressure was working. He claimed tariffs forced China back to the negotiating table, leading to talks aimed at rewriting trade rules. Critics, however, warned that tariffs acted like taxes on American businesses and consumers, increasing costs across multiple sectors. The media framed the situation as a high-stakes poker game between the world's two largest economies. Every new tariff announcement triggered global headlines. Investors watched closely, unsure whether negotiations would lead to peace or deeper conflict. Despite criticism, Trump remained confident. He described the trade war as a necessary battle to secure America's economic future. To his supporters, tariffs represented strength and independence. To opponents, they represented risk and unpredictability. What no one realized at the time was that the trade war would eventually evolve into something even bigger, a long legal fight over presidential authority itself. Years later, the very tariffs that defined Trump's economic legacy would end up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic legal showdowns in modern trade history. When Donald Trump entered the White House, he didn't arrive with a traditional economic playbook. Instead, he brought a decades-long belief that America had been losing the global trade game. For Trump, tariffs weren't just policy tools, they were leverage, pressure, and negotiation power rolled into one. Even before becoming president, Trump argued that U.S. companies were moving factories overseas because foreign competitors had unfair advantages. He believed cheap imports were damaging American manufacturing towns, weakening national pride, and shifting economic power toward rivals like China. While many previous presidents supported free trade agreements, Trump's message was simple: America needed protection. The first major test of this philosophy came in early 2018. The administration announced tariffs on imported solar panels and washing machines. These industries were chosen carefully. They represented domestic manufacturers that had struggled to compete with cheaper imports. Trump framed the move as proof that his administration would prioritize American workers over global trade norms. But the real turning point came shortly after. Using a rarely discussed national security law, the administration imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. The reasoning was controversial. Officials argued that relying too heavily on foreign metals could weaken America's defense capabilities during crises. Critics called the justification exaggerated, but supporters said strong domestic production was essential for national independence. The world reacted instantly. allies like Canada and the European Union were shocked to be included in tariffs justified by national security. Financial markets fluctuated as investors tried to understand whether this was a short-term negotiating tactic or a long-term shift away from globalization. Inside the United States, reactions were mixed. Some factory workers celebrated, believing tariffs could bring jobs back home. Others worried about rising costs, since many American companies relied on imported metals to produce cars, machinery, and infrastructure projects. Economists debated whether tariffs were strategic tools or risky experiments. But Trump, however, doubled down. He described tariffs as a powerful negotiating weapon, claiming that foreign governments would eventually make concessions. For him, trade policy wasn't just economics, it was part of a broader political message that America would no longer accept what he called unfair deals. This early stage of tariffs set the tone for everything that followed. What started as targeted industry protection quickly evolved into a global economic confrontation. And within months, the biggest battle of all would begin, a direct trade war with China that would redefine international relations. When the Supreme Court finally released its decision, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. In a ruling that surprised many observers, the justices determined that several of the broad tariff measures exceeded the authority granted to the president under existing trade laws. The decision emphasized that while the executive branch holds significant power in emergencies, large-scale economic policies require clearer approval from Congress. The court's reasoning centered on constitutional balance. According to the ruling, trade policy carries massive economic consequences, affecting industries, consumers, and international relationships. Allowing sweeping tariffs without explicit legislative backing risked concentrating too much power in one branch of government. Within minutes of the announcement, financial markets reacted sharply. Companies dependent on global supply chains scrambled to understand whether tariffs would remain in place or be removed. Investors analyzed the language of the ruling, searching for clues about how future trade policies might be shaped. Political reactions were just as intense. Supporters of the decision argued that it restored the proper balance of power between Congress and the presidency. They said the ruling protected democratic oversight over major economic decisions. Critics, however, warned that limiting executive authority could weaken America's ability to respond quickly to global competition. For Trump, the ruling represented a direct challenge to a defining element of his economic strategy. Yet instead of stepping back, he framed the decision as proof that the system was resisting bold leadership. Almost immediately, discussions began about alternative legal pathways that could allow tariffs to continue under different authorities. Internationally, the reaction was mixed. Some countries welcomed the ruling, hoping it would reduce trade tensions. Others remained cautious, knowing that U.S. trade policy could shift again quickly. The decision also sent a message to future presidents. Aggressive trade actions would likely face closer legal scrutiny. Legal experts described the ruling as a turning point in the relationship between law and economics. It showed that even powerful economic tools must operate within constitutional boundaries. For the first time in decades, the Supreme Court had stepped directly into the center of a major trade dispute, redefining how far presidential authority could extend. But the story didn't end with the ruling itself. Within hours, new announcements suggested that the administration was already exploring ways to maintain tariffs through different legal mechanisms. The battle over trade policy was far from over. It was simply entering a new phase. As businesses and governments tried to interpret the decision, one question dominated the conversation. Had the Supreme Court truly ended the tariff era, or had it simply forced it to evolve? The final chapters of this story would reveal how quickly economic strategy can adapt and how one ruling could reshape the future of global trade. As years of legal battles slowly climbed through lower courts, one thing became clear. The debate over Trump's tariffs was no longer just about economics. It had transformed into a constitutional question about how much power a president should have over global trade. When the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, it instantly became one of the most closely watched legal showdowns in years. At the heart of the argument was a fundamental issue. Congress traditionally holds authority over tariffs and trade policy, but over decades it had passed laws allowing presidents to act quickly during emergencies or national security threats. Trump's sweeping use of these laws forced the justices to decide whether those powers had limits. Supporters of the tariffs argued that modern economic threats moved too fast for Congress to react. They claimed the president needed flexibility to respond to unfair trade practices, supply chain risks, and geopolitical competition. In their view, tariffs were not only legal but necessary to protect American interests in a rapidly changing world. Opponents presented a different argument. They said that allowing one administration to impose broad tariffs without direct congressional approval could undermine the separation of powers. If tariffs affected entire industries and billions of dollars in trade, critics argued those decisions should require clear legislative backing rather than executive interpretation. During oral arguments, justices questioned both sides intensely. Some focused on whether national security laws were being stretched beyond their original purpose. Others examined whether courts even had the authority to limit trade decisions traditionally handled by political branches. The discussion revealed deep divisions not only among politicians but within the legal community itself. Media coverage turned the hearings into a national event. Economists, business leaders, and foreign governments all watched closely, knowing that the ruling could reshape global trade overnight. Markets reacted cautiously, reflecting uncertainty about whether existing tariffs would survive. For Trump supporters, the case represented a battle against what they viewed as bureaucratic limits on strong leadership. They believed tariffs had forced trading partners to negotiate and had strengthened American industries. For critics, the case was about preventing the expansion of executive power beyond constitutional boundaries. Behind the scenes, businesses prepared for multiple scenarios. Some companies feared that a ruling against tariffs could disrupt supply chains once again. Others hoped the court would reduce uncertainty by clarifying how future trade policies could be implemented. As the hearings concluded, analysts predicted that the decision would not only affect Trump's legacy, but also define how future presidents approached economic policy. Would the court reinforce executive authority, or would it draw a clear line that limited how tariffs could be used? The answer would arrive sooner than expected, and when it did, it would send shockwaves through financial markets, political circles, and international relations. As tariffs remained in place year after year, legal challenges intensified. Businesses, trade groups, and some lawmakers argued that the president's authority had expanded too far. While previous administrations had used tariff powers sparingly, Trump's sweeping approach forced courts to examine laws that had rarely faced serious scrutiny. The core legal question was simple but powerful. Did existing trade laws give the president unlimited authority to impose tariffs, or were there hidden limits that had never been tested? Several lawsuits claimed that broad tariff programs went beyond what Congress intended when it granted emergency or national security powers decades earlier. Early court decisions produced mixed outcomes. Some judges ruled that trade policy was largely a political matter, suggesting courts should avoid interfering with decisions made by the executive branch. Others expressed concern that allowing one person to reshape global trade without clear congressional approval could undermine the balance of power established by the Constitution. Businesses played a major role in pushing these cases forward. Companies affected by tariffs argued that sudden policy changes created financial losses and legal uncertainty. Trade groups claimed that tariffs justified under emergency powers didn't always meet the strict conditions outlined in the law. These arguments gradually gained attention, transforming what had once been technical disputes into major national conversations. Meanwhile, economic data continued fueling debate. Supporters said tariffs strengthened domestic industries and gave the United States leverage in negotiations. Critics pointed to rising consumer costs and shifting supply chains as evidence that tariffs were hurting long-term competitiveness. The legal battles became a stage where economic philosophy and constitutional law collided. Political reactions were equally divided. Some lawmakers defended the president's authority, arguing that strong executive power was necessary to respond quickly to global challenges. Others called for reforms that would require Congress to approve large-scale tariffs, warning that unchecked authority could set dangerous precedents. As cases moved through appellate courts, analysts began predicting that the Supreme Court might eventually step in. The stakes were enormous. A ruling against broad tariff powers could limit future presidents, while a ruling in favor could expand executive authority over trade for decades to come. Public attention grew as media coverage highlighted the potential consequences. Financial markets watched closely, aware that a major legal decision could disrupt billions of dollars in trade. Companies prepared contingency plans, unsure whether existing tariffs would remain in place or disappear overnight. For Trump, the legal challenges represented more than policy disputes. They were battles over leadership style. He argued that decisive action was necessary to confront global economic rivals. Opponents claimed that the Constitution required clearer limits on presidential power. As the cases moved closer to the Supreme Court, tension built across political and economic circles. Few realized just how dramatic the final ruling would be, or how quickly it would reshape the future of American trade policy. As tariffs expanded across multiple industries, it became clear that Donald Trump wasn't using them only as economic policy. He was turning tariffs into a powerful negotiating weapon. Every new tariff announcement carried a political message. The United States was willing to disrupt global trade rules to force better deals. During negotiations with major trading partners, tariffs became leverage. The administration argued that previous trade agreements had allowed other countries to benefit more than the United States. By threatening higher import taxes, Trump aimed to push allies and rivals into renegotiating terms. This strategy reshaped how trade talks were conducted, shifting away from quiet diplomacy toward highly public economic pressure. One of the most significant moments came during the renegotiation of North American trade. Tariffs on metals created tension with Canada and Mexico, but they also increased urgency around negotiations. Eventually, a new trade framework emerged, which the administration presented as proof that aggressive tactics worked. Supporters believed tariffs forced long overdue reforms, while critics said allies were treated like adversaries. The political messaging around tariffs also played a major role domestically. At rallies and speeches, Trump described tariffs as a sign of strength, a way to show that America would no longer accept what he called unfair competition. For many voters, this narrative resonated deeply. It connected economic policy with national identity, turning trade debates into emotional political issues. However, the strategy came with risks. Businesses struggled to predict future costs because tariff levels could change quickly. Some companies delayed investments, waiting for clarity about trade rules. Others accelerated plans to shift manufacturing abroad to avoid uncertainty. Economists warned that while tariffs created short-term negotiating power, they could also introduce long-term instability. Internationally, relations grew more complicated. European leaders criticized the use of national security justifications against allies, and China viewed tariffs as part of a broader geopolitical rivalry. Trade negotiations increasingly overlapped with technology disputes, supply chain security, and political influence. Despite criticism, the administration continued expanding tariffs. New threats were often used as bargaining tools during negotiations, creating a cycle where markets reacted not only to economic data, but also to political rhetoric. Analysts began describing tariffs as a new form of economic diplomacy, one driven less by consensus and more by confrontation. Inside the legal world, questions about presidential authority became more serious. Some lawmakers argued that Congress had gradually handed too much power to the executive branch over decades. Lawsuits started appearing, challenging whether tariffs imposed under emergency or national security claims truly met legal standards. At the time, these legal challenges seemed distant from everyday politics, but slowly they gained momentum. Legal scholars debated whether courts should intervene in trade policy, something historically considered the domain of elected officials. What began as an economic strategy was evolving into a constitutional test, one that would eventually reshape how tariffs could be used by any future president. By the time tariffs had been in place for several years, the debate surrounding them had shifted. In the beginning, the focus was political, strong leadership versus global cooperation. But as data accumulated, economists, business leaders, and policymakers began examining the real-world impact of Trump's trade policies. Supporters pointed to signs of recovery in certain industries. Domestic steel production stabilized, and some manufacturing investments returned to American soil. Tariffs, they argued, gave local companies breathing room to compete against cheaper foreign imports. For workers in regions that had struggled for decades, the policy felt like a long overdue correction. However, the broader economic picture was more complicated. Many studies suggested that tariffs acted like hidden taxes on American businesses and consumers. When companies paid more for imported parts or raw materials, those costs often appeared in higher prices for everyday goods. Retailers, farmers, and manufacturers all faced uncertainty as trade rules kept changing. One of the most visible impacts was on agriculture. Retaliatory tariffs from China and other countries targeted American farmers, reducing export demand for products like soybeans. To offset losses, the government introduced financial assistance programs, highlighting how deeply tariffs were reshaping the domestic economy. Critics argued that while tariffs aimed to protect American workers, they also forced taxpayers to cover the consequences of trade conflicts. Financial markets responded to every new announcement. Some days, stocks surged on hopes of trade deals. Other days, they dropped sharply after new tariff threats. Investors learned that economic policy could shift rapidly based on negotiations, tweets, or political speeches. Volatility became a defining feature of the tariff era. Another major change involved global supply chains. Companies that once relied heavily on China began moving production to countries like Vietnam, Mexico, and India. While this shift reduced dependence on Chinese manufacturing, it also showed that tariffs didn't always bring factories back to the United States. Sometimes they simply moved production elsewhere. Inside Washington, debates intensified. Lawmakers questioned whether the executive branch had too much control over tariffs. Historically, Congress held the power to regulate trade, but decades of laws had gradually delegated authority to presidents. Trump's aggressive use of these powers forced legal experts to reconsider how much authority one administration should have over global commerce. Meanwhile, public opinion remained divided. Some voters saw tariffs as proof of strong leadership willing to challenge the status quo. Others viewed them as unpredictable policies that complicated international relations and raised costs at home. Media coverage reflected this divide, often presenting tariffs as either a bold economic revolution or a risky gamble. As legal challenges slowly moved through the courts, few people expected that the issue would eventually reach the Supreme Court. At first, lawsuits focused on technical trade laws and economic impact, but over time, a deeper constitutional question emerged. Could a president fundamentally reshape global trade without clear approval from Congress? That question would soon transform the tariff debate from an economic argument into a historic legal showdown, one that would redefine the balance of power between the White House and the legislative branch. As the trade war with China dominated headlines, another part of Trump's tariff strategy quietly reshaped global alliances. While many presidents had used tariffs for economic reasons, Trump leaned heavily on a different justification: national security. Under a legal provision known as Section 232, the administration claimed that relying on foreign steel and aluminum threatened America's ability to defend itself during crises. This argument sparked intense debate. Supporters said it made sense. Modern warfare and infrastructure rely heavily on strong domestic manufacturing, and decades of outsourcing had weakened American industrial capacity. Trump's team argued that tariffs were necessary not only to protect jobs, but to ensure the United States could produce critical materials at home. In 2018, tariffs of roughly 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum imports went into effect. Almost immediately, the decision created ripple effects across multiple industries. American steel producers saw rising demand, and some factories reopened or expanded operations. Workers in certain regions viewed tariffs as proof that the government was finally prioritizing domestic manufacturing. But the policy also created unintended consequences. Many American companies that relied on imported metals, including automakers, construction firms, and machinery manufacturers, faced higher costs. Some businesses reported shrinking profit margins, while others passed the increased expenses to consumers. Economists began arguing that while tariffs helped one sector, they could hurt another. International reaction was even more intense. Allies such as Canada and European nations were surprised to be labeled national security threats. In response, several countries introduced retaliatory tariffs on American products, targeting politically sensitive industries like agriculture and motorcycles. Suddenly, the trade conflict expanded beyond China and became a broader dispute with multiple partners. Trump remained firm. He described tariffs as a negotiating tool, often suggesting that once new trade agreements were reached, some restrictions could be lifted. In negotiations with Mexico and Canada, tariffs became part of the pressure that eventually led to a new North American trade agreement. To supporters, this was evidence that the strategy worked. Tough measures forced other countries to compromise. Yet, criticism inside the United States grew louder. Some lawmakers argued that using national security as a justification stretched the law too far. They warned that giving a president wide authority over tariffs could set a precedent for future administrations to reshape trade policy without congressional approval. At the time, these concerns seemed mostly theoretical. However, the legal questions planted during this period would become central years later when courts began examining whether the president's authority had limits. What began as an economic strategy was slowly turning into a constitutional debate, one that would eventually reach the highest court in the country. As markets adjusted to a world where tariffs were no longer rare but routine, businesses started preparing for a new reality. Companies diversified supply chains, investors tracked policy announcements closely, and political analysts began asking a deeper question: were tariffs a temporary negotiating tactic, or had they permanently changed America's role in global trade? The answer would become clearer in the years ahead, especially when economic data started revealing both winners and losers of the tariff era. The Supreme Court ruling was expected to slow down the tariff agenda, but instead, it triggered a rapid political response. Within hours, statements from Trump and his allies made it clear that the fight over tariffs was far from finished. Rather than stepping back, the strategy shifted toward finding new legal pathways to continue economic pressure. Trump framed the decision not as a defeat, but as a challenge to overcome. In speeches and interviews, he argued that tariffs remained essential for protecting American workers and maintaining leverage in global negotiations. According to his message, the ruling didn't end the idea of tariffs, it simply forced the administration to rethink how they were implemented. Behind the scenes, advisors began exploring alternative authorities that could justify new import restrictions. Trade laws contain multiple provisions, some tied to emergencies, others linked to unfair trade practices or national security concerns. By shifting legal justifications, the administration aimed to maintain its aggressive economic stance while complying with the court's interpretation. Markets reacted with mixed signals. On one hand, investors welcomed the idea that sweeping tariffs might be limited. On the other hand, the possibility of new measures created fresh uncertainty. Companies that depended on international supply chains realized that the legal battle had not provided the stability they hoped for. Instead, it had introduced a new phase of unpredictability. Political reactions were intense. Supporters praised the quick response, saying it showed strong leadership unwilling to back down. Critics argued that finding new legal loopholes could lead to another round of court challenges, prolonging economic instability. Lawmakers debated whether Congress should pass clearer trade legislation to prevent future conflicts between branches of government. Internationally, governments watched closely. Some leaders believed the ruling might open the door for calmer trade relations, while others worried that new tariffs could appear under different names or justifications. Negotiations that had paused during the legal battle resumed, but with an added layer of complexity. For businesses, the message was clear. Adaptability had become essential. Companies accelerated efforts to diversify supply chains, reduce dependence on single markets, and prepare for sudden policy changes. The tariff era had already forced global commerce to evolve, and Trump's countermoves suggested that transformation was far from complete. Economists began debating whether the Supreme Court had truly limited executive power or simply changed the way it would be exercised. Some argued that the ruling created a precedent requiring stronger congressional involvement. Others believed presidents would continue finding creative ways to influence trade policy through existing laws. The political narrative surrounding tariffs also shifted. Instead of focusing solely on economic outcomes, discussions turned toward institutional power. Who should control America's trade strategy and how much authority a president should hold during economic conflicts? As new tariff proposals emerged, one thing became clear. The story was no longer just about Trump's policies. It had become a broader debate about the future of economic leadership in the United States. And as the world watched the next steps unfold, analysts began asking a bigger question. What would global trade look like after this legal and political showdown? The Supreme Court's decision didn't close the chapter on tariffs. It opened an entirely new era of uncertainty and opportunity. For the first time in decades, the balance of power between the presidency and Congress over trade policy had been publicly challenged at the highest level. The outcome forced policymakers, businesses, and international leaders to rethink how economic strategy would evolve in the years ahead. One of the biggest questions involved precedent. Future presidents, regardless of political party, would now face closer scrutiny when attempting large-scale trade actions. Legal experts predicted that any sweeping tariff program would likely encounter immediate court challenges, turning economic policy into ongoing legal battles. This shift could slow down decision-making, but might also create clearer rules for future administrations. Global markets began adjusting to a new reality where trade policy was no longer predictable. Investors realized that tariffs were no longer just economic tools. They were legal and political risks that could change overnight. Companies accelerated long-term planning, investing in automation, regional production hubs, and alternative sourcing strategies to reduce dependence on any single country or policy. International relations also entered a new phase. Some allies hoped that legal limits on tariffs would lead to more cooperative trade negotiations. Others remained cautious, recognizing that political leadership could still drive aggressive economic strategies even within new legal boundaries. The world had learned that U.S. trade policy could shift quickly, and that lesson would influence diplomacy for years to come. Inside the United States, debates over economic nationalism versus global cooperation intensified. Supporters of tariffs argued that strong measures were necessary to maintain economic independence and protect critical industries. Critics countered that long-term prosperity depended on stable trade relationships and predictable policies. The Supreme Court ruling didn't end this debate, it amplified it. Perhaps the most important impact was psychological. For decades, trade policy had been viewed as a technical subject handled by experts behind closed doors. Trump's tariff era transformed it into a central political issue, discussed by voters, businesses, and global leaders alike. The court's intervention confirmed that economic decisions could shape constitutional law just as much as politics. As the dust settled, one thing became undeniable. Tariffs had changed more than just trade balances. They had reshaped political messaging, legal interpretation, and global economic expectations. The story that began with a promise to protect American jobs had evolved into a battle over power itself. Who controls the economy, how quickly decisions can be made, and where the limits of leadership truly lie. For viewers looking back at the timeline, the journey from the first tariffs to the Supreme Court ruling reveals a larger lesson. Economic policy is never just about numbers or markets. It is about vision, authority, and the constant struggle between risk and control. And as the world moves forward, one question will continue to define the future of trade. Will tariffs remain a dominant tool of global competition, or will new legal boundaries force leaders to find different ways to shape the economy? The answer, like the tariff era itself, is still being written.